this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Midelis, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got an incredible program lined up for you today. Our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, is going to be speaking with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C., about a whole host of different topics today. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at what's making news across the border, starting with Chicago at the top of our show and the state of Illinois, both filing a lawsuit aiming to stop President Donald Trump's administration from sending hundreds of National Guard troops to Chicago. Now, Trump moved to deploy National Guard troops from another city on Saturday by authorizing 300 troops to protect federal officers and assets in Chicago. He has long said he will send troops to the Democratic city, but it was not immediately clear on when or exactly where they would be deployed. That lawsuit was filed this morning. Now, this morning, a coalition of Chicago journalists and press organizations also filed a federal lawsuit, this one against Homeland Security, ICE, and other DHS agencies, accusing them of waging a campaign of violence against reporters covering the immigration protests in Chicago. In the lawsuit, the journalists claim that federal agents have repeatedly fired less than lethal munitions directly at clearly identifiable members of the press. Also happening late Sunday night, a federal judge temporarily blocked the Trump administration from deploying any National Guard units to Oregon, including the California National Guard. California and Oregon sought the temporary restraining order after the president sent Guard members from California to Oregon earlier on Sunday. On Saturday, that same judge had temporarily blocked the administration from deploying Oregon National Guard troops to Portland. The judge, who was appointed by President Trump during his first term, issued a more sweeping order late Sunday. She questioned the government's attorney, asking how the move to send the California and Texas troops to Oregon was not, quote, in direct contravention of the order I issued yesterday, end quote. Time now to bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and our guest for today's program, Mr. Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, Aaron. It's always great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start right off with the deployment of troops. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, where I am here, says that he's willing to send 400 National Guard troops to Chicago, to Portland. Your thoughts on this? Is this necessary?
Well, of course, the governments in Chicago and Portland say it's not. In Portland, Judge Immergut, who is a Trump-appointed judge who joined the bench in his first term, noted that in the days leading up to the deployment call-up on September 28th, there had been barely any protests outside of a single ICE facility, certainly nothing like the war-ravaged Portland that President Trump claimed. And while in Chicago there has been more street-level resistance to the Trump administration, Governor Pritzker and the Chicago local leaders say that there is no need to call in the National Guard. This is a hotly debated issue, and there will be a court hearing later today about whether or not Chicago can block President Trump from bringing in the National Guard.
And as you remember, on Friday, there was an incident involving Border Patrol agents who actually fired at someone in Chicago, and that person actually has been released from the hospital. DHS is saying that the agents were endangered. The Trump administration, as you said, says that it's a war zone. It's a hot area. It's an area that needs to get under control. But you're saying that's really not the case.
Yeah, I think obviously there is some pushback against the Trump administration. And it's particularly notable when we look at Portland, that in Portland, protests had been very minimal in the days before President Trump called out the National Guard on September 28th. As Judge Immergut noted, it was really just a couple of dozen people, usually sitting around in lawn chairs. But the moment that he activated the Guard, suddenly the protests swelled in size and hundreds of people started coming out, and there were slightly larger clashes. So I think what Chicago is saying is the same thing that Los Angeles leaders said. If you send the National Guard here, it's actually going to inflame the situation and cause more unrest than if you had simply let local law enforcement deal with violations of laws that may be occurring.
Well, like you said, there's a hearing today, so we will be watching that and see what happens there. We want to get to the big news, the government shutdown, the start of the second work week, day number 4, with many furloughed employees, hundreds, thousands furloughed. Democrats are holding out for tax exemptions for the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Republicans are messaging and saying that actually under that program, undocumented immigrants received health care. Is there truth to that?
No. I want to be crystal clear about this. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Medicaid, and they are not eligible for subsidies on the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. They cannot get tax credits like American citizens can. So a lot of this debate is really over a provision that restricted Medicaid eligibility and reimbursements for lawfully present immigrants, people with temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, refugees, asylees, people who are not U.S. citizens, yes, but they are also not undocumented immigrants.
Could there be any confusion, the fact that maybe if an undocumented person goes to an ER and their arm is half hanging off, that, you know, they receive care? Is that perhaps a confusion that's happening here? Because it sounds very clear to me that Republicans are saying that under the previous plan, immigrants were getting these insurance plans and they weren't supposed to. I mean, is that a valid confusion? Could that be what's happening here?
Well, I think that's something people are being confused about because opponents of the Democrats are pushing that exact narrative. You had the White House press secretary, Vice President Vance, all mentioning emergency care. And crucially, what the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did was it cut reimbursement rates to states for uncompensated care. Of course, uncompensated care in emergency rooms is not the same thing as getting health insurance, and undocumented immigrants did not receive any other benefits than not dying when they went to an emergency room. So really what this just means is that states are going to have to shoulder more of a burden of uncompensated care when people go to an emergency room and they don't have care. But crucially, hospitals still have to treat people in emergencies. That's due to a 1980s law signed by Ronald Reagan called EMTALA, and it is not impacted in any way. Essentially, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act just made it more of an unfunded mandate for hospitals and for local governments.
And as you know, here in Texas, actually, every hospital is supposed to ask everyone who enters, are you undocumented or not?
That's
so
right.
They are tracking that here.
They are tracking it, but they still deliver care. Mm-hmm. And so the key difference is that under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the hospitals in the states may be reimbursed from the federal government for less funding, but any undocumented immigrant in Texas would still, of course, be able to go to the emergency room if they had a life-threatening issue.
What about the shutdown with regards to immigration courts? How is that affecting cases? What has your organization seen?
Yeah, I think with immigration, we are seeing the shutdown actually having very few impacts. The legal immigration system is funded by fees paid for by U.S. citizens, employers, and immigrants themselves, and so they can keep operating even when government funding shuts down. ICE and the Border Patrol are deemed essential, so therefore they keep carrying out enforcements. The biggest shift from previous shutdowns, including the then record shutdown in 2019, is that the non-detained immigration courts are proceeding forward with hearings.
Okay.
6 years ago, those courts were paused during the entirety of the shutdown. Today, the Trump administration has declared that they are essential given the size of the court backlog. And that means that unlike during previous shutdowns, hearings are continuing as normal.
Okay, help me understand something, because I'm getting a lot of different answers from both sides. During the Trump administration, we were told that certain agencies are not affected, for instance, Veterans Affairs. Yet 14,000 workers from the VA have been furloughed. DHS is saying, as you mentioned, ICE agents, Border Patrol agents are essential workers. They continue to work. They're not getting paid right now, but they are continuing to work. Is there money flowing to all the agencies who need it? Why are they furloughing 14,000 people from the Veterans Affairs if they say that money has already been funded? I'm sorry, but down here, far from D.C., we're very confused.
Yeah, it's a good question. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for why the VA has furloughed those because I'm not very familiar with what's going on at the VA. But what we do know is that the White House has messaged that they intend to use the shutdowns as an opportunity to lay off large portions of the workforce, including people at agencies around the government. So it's possible this is part of the White House's plans to carry out larger reductions in force, larger layoffs than they had originally been able to do when the government was open. It's also possible that it's not related to that. And so just because I'm not familiar with the VA, I can't give you a firm answer.
Well, let's stick with ICE, because that is something that you're more familiar with, ICE and DHS. And to do these missions, they need transportation, gasoline, canine units. You know, it's not just the agent who's going without pay. There's some working expenses. How is that? Where's that money coming from? Is that reserves?
Well, some of it's coming from reserves, and in ICE's case, some of it's coming from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act itself. When Congress passed that law in July, they gave ICE $45 billion for detention and $29.9 billion for things like transportation, removal, hiring, and all of those things. So large portions of ICE are actually separately funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and they can keep enforcement going and even potentially pay some law enforcement officers should the shutdown continue for longer.
Okay.
Of course, Kristi Noem has said that DHS officers are going without pay, but should the shutdown continue, they may seek to tap some of those funds to keep the pay flowing.
Thank you. I've been trying to get that answer. And so there is money. The Big Beautiful Bill, it was passed. It was signed by the president on July 4th. And that money is there and that stands. And so that is not affected at all by the shutdown.
That's right, because when Congress passed that law, it said ICE could spend that money through September 30th, 2029.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're speaking with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C., about several different topics today, and we're going to continue that conversation right after the break. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and joining myself and our South Texas correspondent today, Sandra Sanchez, is Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at American Immigration Council.
Aaron, let's talk about immigration judges. There are reports today that there were more firings of judges this summer. We had a couple dozen fired, reports that more have been fired. And today, coincidentally, begins the training for at least 100 Army Reserve and National Guard lawyers, JAG officers, who are being trained to be immigration judges. The administration wants to bring in 600 military-trained attorneys temporarily to take over these positions. Is this a good idea? What's happening?
Well, first off, I don't think it's a good idea, and I'll explain why. So far, the Trump administration has fired or seen resign nearly 150 immigration judges in total. Now, this comes at a time when the immigration court backlogs are at their highest level. Many of the judges who have been fired say that the only reason they were fired is because a management believed that they were too liberal or that they granted cases too often or cared too much about due process. And so those judges that have been fired have generally been the ones who had higher than average grant rates. That means that they were more likely than the average judge to allow an immigrant to stay in the United States. Whereas the judges who have been allowed to stay are more likely those whose grant rates are below average. They are less likely to allow immigrants to stay in the United States. And now that over 100 judges have been fired or have resigned, we're seeing them being replaced with military JAGs. Now, of course, military JAGs are conscientious lawyers, many of whom would be good at the job if they had the opportunity to really study it and become experts. But instead, what we have heard is that these JAGs are going to be put through even less training than a normal immigration judge gets. And that means by the time they sit down at the bench and are set to hear their first cases, they will be less informed about immigration judge than your average less informed about immigration law than your average immigration judge. And these are cases that can be matters of life or death.
Yeah, we were speaking with immigration lawyer Claudia Galan recently. She said that these JAGs are going to receive 6 weeks of training. And she mentioned typically an immigration judge takes anywhere up to 7 years to fully train before they take the bench. I mean, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, just for some clarity, the 7 years is previously until now the amount of experience that was necessary for anyone to be deemed a temporary immigration judge.
Wow.
So the law does permit the government to designate some people as temporary judges, but in the past they said you needed to have 7 years of experience before you could be put on the bench as a temporary judge. Now it's going to be people who have never heard anything about immigration law and are given 6 weeks of training and are being assigned to cases that will decide basic questions like whether or not somebody would be tortured in their home country and should be given protections.
And it's kind of universally accepted that immigration law is one of the hardest fields to master. I mean, you've been at this for years. We call you, we write to you, we ask you questions for everything. I mean, it's not an easy subject, right?
No, it's an extremely complicated subject. And, courts and judges over the years have called it second in complexity only to tax law. You can study immigration law for a decade and still only have scratched the surface of portions of immigration law. And so when we're looking at, what has been described as death penalty cases in traffic court, you want to have immigration judges who know what they are talking about. But here we're going to have people who really learned the first thing ever about immigration law 6 weeks ago on the bench, making decisions that will decide whether a person gets to stay or has to leave.
And again, these are to be temporary judges, so we're not really sure the longevity of how long they will stay on the bench, but they will be making decisions once they take the bench.
That's what we've heard. And, as you said, there was an initial class of 100. We hear that there are going to be potentially hundreds more immigration judges. Of course, this is an administration that has been fairly hostile to due process. And while not saying anything about the quality of the lawyers that JAGs are, there are many JAGs who are good, conscientious lawyers who will do the best that they can in the situation that they've been put in. I don't think any person should be making these kind of decisions in cases this important to individual lives with just 6 weeks of training.
Well, let's move on to DACA because we're hearing some movement within possible applications to DACA to begin. There's been a years-long fight. It's actually been held up here in a court in Brownsville. It may allow more people to enroll, but in Texas they won't have work permits. What's the status going on there with DACA?
Yeah, so for now, nothing has changed. But what happened is that recently the U.S. government put forth its plans for restarting the program and filed that in the court case in Brownsville. And what the U.S. government said is that, right now there is a regulation on the books, and that has been blocked only in the state of Texas. So should this court go forward, should the plans continue, what's going to happen is that people could apply for DACA, newly apply for DACA who were unable to get it before, and only be able to get in Texas protection from deportation, but they would not be able to work. But if they lived outside of Texas, they would get protections from deportation and a work permit, the ability to work. Of course, really crucial for people to understand, this would not protect anyone who wasn't eligible for the original version of DACA. That means it's only people who arrived in the United States as children before 2007, before June 2007. So we are talking now people who are no longer children, people who are in their 20s, 30s, or even potentially 40s, who would be potentially getting DACA if it were to restart. But those in Texas would not be able to work legally. And if they were to move into Texas from another state, they would have to lose their work permit. Of course, crucially, this would not impact anyone who has DACA today. So those who have DACA today would not be impacted. They would be able to continue working. This would just be about people who tried to apply, in the last 4 or 5 years, but were unable to because of the court fight.
Let's talk about asylum because people cannot come up to a port of entry and claim asylum under the Trump administration right now. But on Sunday, Stephen Miller, a Trump official, tweeted, quote, "Asylum seekers is the phrase of choice for those boosting mass illegal migration. No alien who crosses our land border is even plausibly eligible for political asylum since they've crossed through multiple, quote, safe countries, unquote, first. It's fraud all the way down." Now, you responded on X to this comment and you disagree with it. Why?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First, let's look at the English language. If you are someone who is seeking asylum, you are an asylum seeker. But second, as a basic premise, U.S. asylum law does not require you to apply for asylum in the first country you pass through. This is a very common confusion, in part because I think in people understand that in Europe and other parts of the world that is true. So Europe has something called the Dublin regulation, where if, for example, you enter the European Union in Greece and you then can't move to Germany, you have to apply for asylum in Greece. The United States has nothing like this. Now, President Biden did try to impose something like this through a regulation, but that is tied up in court and it's not required by the law. So, as Stephen Miller is very aware, many politicians have sought to change that law to impose those conditions that he expects, that he wants. But as it stands, US law does not prevent someone from seeking asylum, even if they pass through Mexico first.
Yeah, there had been a big push during the Biden administration for this third country, safe countries agreement. In fact, there was reports the State Department would set up offices in Costa Rica and other places for migrants to get there and to apply, and it would be safe for them to wait there. But I don't really think that got off the ground. These offices were open.
Well, the Biden administration actually did have some pilot, what they called safe mobility offices in Costa Rica and Panama and Guatemala. And at those offices, some limited people could apply for refugee status, which is what's available for people who are not physically present in the United States. But those were really never operated outside of a pilot program. A few hundred, maybe a few thousand people were able to apply for some form of status and get screened as refugees. All of those have now been shut down by the Trump administration.
Okay. Last Friday, there was this term, Freaky Friday, raids of children, raids by ICE and pressures for children 14 and younger to self-deport. And reports that they were going to pay them $2,500 if they would self-deport. And if they wouldn't, then they would tell on their family members or there would be some consequences to their family members. What do you know about this operation?
There's a lot that's not known about this. ICE strongly denies that there was an operation by that name. But there are a couple of things that we know has happened. First, the Department of Homeland Security is confirming that they are going to offer unaccompanied migrant children who are facing removal $2,500 to give up their cases and accept being deported back to their home countries. Now, how a child could take that offer is an open question, something that we are still trying to figure out. But for now, that is what they have confirmed. Now, the other thing that we have confirmed is that the US government said that when children turn 18, so a 17-year-old who is in a government shelter for unaccompanied children, when they turn 18, rather than being released, they would be sent to an ICE detention center and jailed. And a federal court has already blocked that.
Wow.
We've been speaking with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we are out of time,
We
Aaron.
always run out of time. But
yeah.
We'd like to have you back on again.
Yeah, definitely. You've been an incredible host of information for not just our viewers, but for us as well. So we appreciate you being here today, sir.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, stay with us because Border Report Live has got a little bit longer to go. We'll be back in 1 minute. And welcome back to today's edition of Border Report Live. As we all know, police work is pretty dangerous work, and officers in Tijuana are battling cartels every day. But as Jorge Ventura tells us, their law enforcement have taken a step towards modernization.
We got an inside look in the Tijuana Police Department's elite drone unit. The Tijuana police say they are taking a step forward in modernizing their fight against drug cartels right here on the southern border. These high-tech drones are able to disrupt and monitor cartel activity throughout the entire city of Tijuana, one of the most dangerous cities in the entire world. I got to speak with the Tijuana Police drone commander, Fernando Silva. He says that his police unit has 14 drones able to be deployed to crime scenes around the city in just under 2 minutes. And once that drone is deployed, officers back in the command center can watch a real-time feed of the drone's flight, giving officers a live look at the situation before arriving. This information has become crucial when officers are responding to incidents involving armed cartel operatives. While in the command center during our interview, we got the ability to watch in real time how a drone tracked down a suspect attempting to evade authorities. The drone was able to locate the individual, relay that information back to officers on the ground, leading to an arrest, one of the many advantages of the eye in the sky.
When the criminal is lost sight of, the drone can keep maintaining sight. We've had many successful cases where a criminal is hiding or some suspect is running, throwing weapons or something, and the drone sees them.
The Tijuana police says that these drones are now giving them an edge in a battle to take control back of the streets of Tijuana. Right now, Tijuana has become a battleground for rival cartels battling for smuggling routes to the U.S. And police say they're seeing such great success with this drone program that other Mexican cities and states could model them. Reporting for News Nation, Jorge Ventura.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you to our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and of course, our interview today, Mr. Aaron Reichland-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. That is going to do it for us today. We'll see you all tomorrow.